Explaining the 1973 Chilean coup. In the 1950s, many South American countries were under dictatorships. Despite this, Chile was still a democratic country. However, since the Cuban Revolution, the United States had become more interested in Latin American politics. Projects like the Alliance for Progress would send out millions of dollars to their allies such as Betancourt in Venezuela. They would also help to start coups in countries like Bolivia and Brazil. In 1964, the United States would send money to Montalva in Chile. This was to help Montalva beat Salvador Allende, a socialist, in the upcoming Chilean election. Montalva would win the election, but because in Chile no presidents can serve over 2 terms, Montalva was forced to step down in 1970. Montalva's party, known as the Christian Democratic Party, would then be taken over by Radomiro Tomic. Sadly for Tomic, he would lose the election to George Alessandri and Salvador Allende. However, no candidate won an outright majority, so the National Congress would have to choose who would be the next president. The CIA would attempt to get the National Congress to vote in former President George Alessandri. He would later resign and bring Montalva back into power. None of this would matter, however, as the Congress would choose Salvador Allende as the next president. From there, Salvador Allende would begin to implement many socialist reforms. This would make Salvador Allende popular among Chileans, but the United States would withdraw aid from Chile, and Chile would go through massive inflation. Plus, his connections with other socialist leaders such as Fidel Castro would worry those on the right. So, in Parliament, they would unite to form the Confederation of Democracy to stop further reforms. The CIA would also help fund other anti-Allende things, such as the El Mercurio newspaper. That newspaper would call for him to be overthrown. He also didn't have much support from the right-wing military officers who lived in relatively closed-off communities. However, these officers would still have a good deal of political influence inside of Chile. In 1969, soldiers would band together to demand higher wages in the Tecnozo insurrection. However, the new commander-in-chief, René Schneider, would promise, when Allende came into power, that he would keep the military out of politics. This angered people who thought that Allende would start a communist dictatorship, so Schneider was murdered. His replacement, Carlos Prat, would keep these policies, but paramilitary groups such as Fatherland and Liberty would rise up. After a few years of rising tensions, in 1973, Lieutenant Colonel Roberto Super would take his tank regiment to the presidential palace. Although this coup attempt would fail, it would become clear that Allende, without the help of the military and national police, could not restore order, and strikes would break out across the country. The wives of military officers would protest outside of Prat's house, who would then resign and be replaced with Augustus Pinochet. The Confederation of Democracy would then ask the ministers and military to hold a vote to put an end to Allende's alleged unconstitutional practices. Allende would respond by saying that his practices were constitutional and that the vote was sowing disorder. However, in early September, he had promised to hold a referendum on his policies. Fearing that the country was becoming too left-wing, the head of the Navy, José Toribio Marino, would gain the support of the head of the Air Force and Police Force, Gustavo Lee, and Cesar Mendoza. Then, with the help of Augustus Pinochet, they would stage a coup on the early morning of September 11th, 1973. Commandos would blockade the port of Valparaiso, and the Army and Air Force would destroy TV and radio stations. Allende would retreat to the presidential palace with members of the military that remained loyal to him. Because of this, he would now have very little communication with the rest of the country. By 9 a.m., the military would state that they had taken over most of the country and would demand that Allende resign. Allende would refuse, and would also refuse office for escaping the palace to attempt a counter-coup later on. Instead of escaping, he would remain within the presidential palace for a few hours while the capital was being bombed. Just before the palace was captured, it is believed that Allende committed suicide inside of the palace. With Allende now gone, Pinochet, Marino, Mendoza, and Lee would initially share power. In conclusion, the 1973 Chilean coup would be a coup in which a right-wing military would attempt to overthrow a left-wing leader and would succeed. Today, it is still unknown whether or not the CIA was involved in the coup, as it is known that they disliked Allende. What is known, however, is that Augusto Pinochet would eventually declare himself president in a military dictatorship and would kill thousands, especially his political opponents. Thank you for watching this video on the 1973 Chilean coup.